My mother always said blood was thicker than water, but she never mentioned how easily it could poison everything it touched. Standing in the wreckage of my law office, surrounded by seized files and broken dreams, I finally understood that the person I trusted most had orchestrated my complete destruction. The betrayal cut deeper than any courtroom defeat ever could, and as I watched my life's work crumble, I knew that justice would have to be served, one way or another. I am Victoria Castellano, a 34-year-old criminal defense attorney in Chicago, Illinois. After 12 years of building my practice from nothing, I had finally earned the respect I'd fought for in a male-dominated field. My specialty was defending the wrongfully accused, and my track record spoke for itself, 87% success rate, with several high-profile cases that had made national headlines. I thought I had everything under control, every variable accounted for. But family has a way of blindsiding you when you least expect it. The day everything changed started like any other. I was preparing for the biggest case of my career, defending Marcus Rivera, a young father wrongfully accused of armed robbery. The evidence was circumstantial at best, and I had spent months building an airtight defense. Marcus had become more than just a client. His story reminded me why I'd become a lawyer in the first place. His daughter was the same age I was when my father walked out, leaving my mother Isabella to raise me alone in a cramped South Side apartment. My mother had always been my anchor, my strongest supporter through law school, through the lean years when I was starting my practice, through every triumph and setback. She worked double shifts as a hospital administrator to help pay for my education, never missing a single graduation or court appearance that mattered to me. When I finally made partner at 30 and opened my own firm 2 years later, she was the first person I called. "Mija," she had said, tears in her voice. "Your father would be so proud." Isabella Castellano was a force of nature. 5 feet of pure determination wrapped in designer suits she couldn't afford, but wore anyway because, as she put it, respect starts with how you present yourself to the world. She had taught me everything. I knew about fighting for what you believe in, about never backing down when you know you're right, which is why what happened next felt like having the ground ripped out from under my feet. The call came at 11:30 on a Tuesday night. I was in my office reviewing witness statements for the Rivera case when my phone buzzed with my mother's ringtone, La Vida es una Carnaval by Celia Cruz, her favorite song. "Victoria, we need to talk," she said without preamble. Her voice had a quality I'd never heard before, cold, distant, almost businesslike. "Mom? What's wrong? You sound... I'm at your office building. Come down to the parking garage. Now." The line went dead. I stared at my phone, a chill running down my spine. My mother never came to my office unannounced, especially not at midnight. I grabbed my keys and headed for the elevator, my mind racing through possibilities. Was she sick? Had something happened to one of my aunts? I found her standing next to her silver Honda Civic, still wearing her hospital scrubs. Even in the harsh fluorescent light of the parking garage, she looked smaller somehow, older than her 58 years. But her eyes, those dark eyes that had watched over me my entire life, were hard as obsidian. "Mom, what's going on? You're scaring me." She didn't speak for a long moment, just studied my face as if she were memorizing it. Finally, she reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope, thick and official-looking. "I'm sorry, Victoria, but some opportunities only come once in a lifetime." I took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were photocopies of documents. I recognized immediately privileged attorney-client communications, case strategies, witness statements, everything related to the Rivera case, everything that should have been confidential, everything that could destroy my defense and send an innocent man to prison. "What is this?" I whispered, though part of me already knew. "Insurance," she said simply. "Detective Rodriguez came to me 3 weeks ago. He knew about your financial troubles, the mortgage on the firm, the loans you took out to cover operating expenses. He offered a way out. Detective Carlos Rodriguez, the lead investigator on the Rivera case, the man whose shoddy police work had led to Marcus's arrest in the first place. The man I had humiliated in court during a previous case, exposing his pattern of planting evidence and coercing confessions. He had sworn he'd get even with me someday. You gave him privileged information. The words came out flat, emotionless, because the alternative was screaming. You violated attorney-client privilege. I couldn't finish. The betrayal was too massive to process all at once. Rodriguez knew things, Victoria. Things about your finances that even you don't know. The IRS investigation that's coming, the complaints he's filed with the state bar. He could have destroyed you completely. Her voice remained steady, clinical. This way, you lose one case but keep your license. Marcus Rivera was going to be convicted anyway. His own gang members turned on him. At least this way you survive. Marcus is innocent. The words exploded out of me, echoing off the concrete walls. You know that. I told you about the case, about his daughter, about how the police railroaded him because he wouldn't give up information he didn't have. For the first time, my mother's composure cracked slightly. Innocent men go to prison every day, Victoria. You can't save them all. But I could have saved this one. I clutched the envelope so tightly the papers crinkled. Do you have any idea what you've done? This isn't just about Marcus. This is about everything I've built, everything I believe in, my reputation, my integrity. Your integrity doesn't pay the bills, she snapped. And there it was. The real Isabella Castellano, the woman who had clawed her way out of poverty through sheer force of will, who had taught me that sometimes you had to compromise your principles to survive. Rodriguez offered me $50,000 for the information and a guarantee that you'd walk away from this mess with your license intact. I did what I had to do to protect you. The parking garage spun around me. $50,000. The exact amount my mother needed for the surgery, her insurance wouldn't cover. The surgery for the cervical cancer she thought I didn't know about. The surgery she had been quietly saving for while working extra shifts and selling pieces of her jewelry one by one. The cancer, I said quietly. She stiffened. I don't know what you're talking about. I saw the medical bills on your kitchen table last month when I came over for dinner. I saw the appointment cards, the treatment schedules. You thought you were being so careful, but I'm a lawyer, Mom. I noticed details. For a moment, the mask slipped completely, and I saw the woman who had raised me, scared, desperate, fighting a battle she wasn't sure she could win. But then the hardness returned. Then you understand why I did it. I wanted to understand. God, how I wanted to find a way to justify what she had done, to forgive her, to wrap my arms around her and tell her we'd figure out another way. But Marcus Rivera's face kept flashing in my mind, his quiet dignity as he maintained his innocence, his desperate hope that justice would prevail, his 4-year-old daughter who drew pictures of her daddy coming home. There had to be another way, I said. There wasn't. She pulled out a second envelope, thinner than the first. Rodriguez wants you to know that the information has already been leaked to the prosecutor's office. They'll be filing a motion to dismiss your case by Thursday. Marcus Rivera will accept a plea deal, 10 years instead of life without parole. Everyone wins. Everyone except Marcus. Everyone except his daughter. Everyone except me. My mother got back into her car without another word. I stood there in the parking garage until her taillights disappeared, clutching the evidence of my own destruction, trying to understand how the woman who had taught me to fight for justice had just handed me the tools of my defeat. The next morning brought fresh horrors. I arrived at my office to find 2 FBI agents waiting in the lobby, armed with a search warrant. Someone, Rodriguez most likely, had made good on my mother's prediction about the IRS investigation. They spent 6 hours going through my files, my computers, my bank records, every case I had ever worked, every client I had ever represented, laid bare under the harsh fluorescent lights of bureaucratic scrutiny. Marcus Rivera called that afternoon, his voice hollow with defeat. Ms. Castellano, they offered me a deal. 10 years if I plead guilty, life without parole if we go to trial. They say you can't help me anymore, that there are problems with your license. He paused, and I could hear his daughter playing in the background, her laughter a bitter counterpoint to our conversation. What should I do? I stared at the wall of my office, at the diplomas and awards that had once meant everything to me. Marcus, The words stuck in my throat. What could I say? That my own mother had sold him out for the price of her medical treatment? That justice was apparently a luxury I could no longer afford? Take the deal, I whispered, hating myself. With every syllable. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The line went quiet for a long time. When Marcus finally spoke again, his voice was steady but tired. I know you tried, Miss Castellano. I know you believed in me. That means something, even if it doesn't change anything. After I hung up, I sat in my office and cried for the first time since my father left. I cried for Marcus, for his daughter who would grow up visiting her innocent father in prison. I cried for my mother, dying of cancer and so desperate for treatment that she had traded her soul for medical bills. But mostly, I cried for the naive woman I had been 24 hours ago, the one who believed that family loyalty and justice could coexist, that the people who loved you would never be the ones to destroy you. The state bar investigation was swift and merciless. Within a week, I was facing suspension of my license pending a full inquiry into the allegations of financial impropriety and ethical violations. The news media, always eager for a story about a fallen attorney, picked up the story with relish. "Hotshot defense lawyer under investigation," read the headline in the Chicago Tribune. The article detailed my financial struggles, my recent string of high-profile cases, and the unnamed sources who suggested I had been cutting corners to stay afloat. I knew Rodriguez was behind the leaks, feeding the press just enough information to destroy my reputation without implicating himself in the larger conspiracy. My mother's betrayal had given him everything he needed to orchestrate my downfall while keeping his own hands clean. The hardest part was the silence from my colleagues. Lawyers I had worked with for years suddenly stopped returning my calls. Referrals dried up overnight. Clients canceled retainers and demanded refunds I couldn't afford. Within 2 weeks, I was forced to close my practice and lay off my assistant and paralegal, 2 women who had been with me since I opened my firm, who had believed in me and my mission. I moved out of my downtown apartment and into a studio in Pilsen, a neighborhood that reminded me of where I had grown up, all struggling families and broken dreams. I took a job as a public defender, the only position available to someone with my tarnished reputation. The pay was a third of what I had been making, barely enough to cover rent and groceries, but it was honest work defending people who couldn't afford better. My mother called twice in those first few weeks. I let both calls go to voicemail. "Victoria, please call me back. We need to talk about this. You don't understand the position I was in." "Mia, I know you're angry, but I'm your mother. I did what I thought was best for both of us. Please don't shut me out." I deleted both messages without listening to them completely. I couldn't bear to hear her voice. Couldn't reconcile the woman who had raised me with the person who had traded my integrity for her survival. But isolation has a way of breeding its own poison, and as the weeks turned into months, my grief began to calcify into something harder and more dangerous. I started researching Rodriguez, digging into his background with the same thoroughness I had once applied to building cases for my clients. What I found was a pattern of corruption stretching back years, evidence planted, witnesses intimidated, confessions coerced. He had built his career on the backs of innocent people, and he had used my mother's desperation to add my name to his list of victories. The idea came to me slowly, growing from a whisper in the back of my mind into a roar I couldn't ignore. Rodriguez had destroyed my life by exploiting my mother's weakness, but in doing so, he had made a critical error. He had underestimated how far I was willing to go to get it back. I began building my case against Rodriguez the same way I had once built defenses for my clients, methodically, carefully, gathering every piece of evidence I could find. I reached out to other defense attorneys who had faced him in court, victims of his manufactured cases, even former police officers who had grown disgusted with his methods. What emerged was a picture of systematic corruption that went far beyond my own situation. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Detective Maria Santos, Rodriguez's former partner, who had requested a transfer after witnessing too many of his shortcuts. She agreed to meet me at a coffee shop in Logan Square, far from the courthouse and police stations where Rodriguez held sway. "I've been waiting for someone like you to come forward," she said, sliding a thumb drive across the table. Internal Affairs has been investigating Carlos for months, but they needed someone with legal expertise to help them build a case, someone he had wronged personally, who would have the motivation to see it through. The thumb drive contained years of evidence, recorded conversations, falsified reports, witness statements detailing Rodriguez's pattern of abuse. It was enough to destroy him, to expose the web of corruption that had cost so many people their freedom and their lives. Why now? I asked. Why me? Santos stared into her coffee cup, her face troubled. Because the Marcus Rivera case wasn't his only mistake. There are 3 other innocent people in prison right now because of evidence Carlos planted or witnesses he intimidated. And there's a 4th case coming to trial next month. A teenager who reminds me of my own son. If we don't stop him now, Carlos is going to keep destroying lives until someone puts him in a cage where he belongs. That night, I sat in my studio apartment, staring at the thumb drive and thinking about justice. Real justice, not the compromised version I had been forced to accept when my mother betrayed me. For months, I had been drowning in bitterness and self-pity, but Santos had given me something I hadn't felt since my world collapsed: purpose. I called Internal Affairs the next morning and offered my services as a consulting attorney on their investigation into Rodriguez. Within hours, I was sitting in a conference room with FBI agents and prosecutors, laying out a case that would not only destroy Rodriguez's career but potentially overturn dozens of wrongful convictions he had engineered over the years. The investigation moved quickly once it had proper legal backing. Rodriguez, confident in his immunity after destroying me so thoroughly, had grown sloppy. The evidence against him was overwhelming, not just the corruption Santos had documented, but a pattern of civil rights violations that stretched back to the beginning of his career. But building a case against Rodriguez was only half of my plan for justice. The other half required confronting the woman who had made it all possible. I drove to my mother's apartment on a cold Tuesday evening in November, 6 months after our confrontation in the parking garage. She had finished her cancer treatment. Successfully, according to my Aunt Carmen, who had been providing me with updates despite my mother's wishes. The $50,000 Rodriguez had paid her had covered her medical expenses, just as she had hoped. She opened the door wearing a bathrobe and slippers, looking frail but determined. The chemo had taken her hair, but she wore a colorful headscarf that reminded me of the ones she used to tie around my head when I was little, playing dress-up in her closet. Victoria. She stepped back to let me in, her eyes wary but hopeful. I wasn't sure you would ever come. Her apartment looked exactly the same as always. Family photos covering every surface, the smell of her perfume and Cuban coffee, the Virgin of Guadalupe candle burning on the kitchen counter. It was the place where I had eaten 1,000 meals, where she had helped me with homework and listened to my teenage heartbreaks and celebrated every milestone of my life. It felt like visiting a museum of my former self. I came to tell you that Detective Rodriguez is going to be arrested tomorrow morning, I said, still standing by the door. The FBI has been building a case against him for months. He's going to prison for a very long time. My mother sank into her favorite armchair, the one she'd bought secondhand when I was in law school, but had reupholstered twice to keep it looking nice. And you helped them build this case. It wasn't a question. She knew me well enough to understand that I wouldn't let Rodriguez's crimes go unpunished, even if it meant destroying the man who had destroyed me. I did, along with several other attorneys and police officers who were sick of watching him railroad innocent people. I sat down on the couch, maintaining the distance between us that had defined our relationship for the past 6 months. Marcus Rivera will be released within the month. The other innocent people Rodriguez sent to prison will have their cases reviewed. Justice will finally be served. And me? She asked quietly. What happens to me? This was the question I had been dreading, the one that had kept me awake for weeks as the investigation progressed. My mother had been a co-conspirator in Rodriguez's corruption, even if her motives were understandable. She had taken money in exchange for violating attorney-client privilege, contributing to the wrongful conviction of an innocent man. Under the law, she was as guilty as Rodriguez himself. But she was also my mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything for my future, who had worked double shifts and sold her jewelry and eaten ramen noodles for dinner so I could have the education I needed to succeed. The woman who was fighting cancer and had been desperate enough to trade her integrity for the chance to live. The FBI knows about your involvement, I said carefully. But they're more interested in Rodriguez than in the people he exploited. If you're willing to testify against him, to admit what he asked you to do and how he manipulated you, they're prepared to offer you immunity. Relief flooded her face, quickly replaced by shame. I'm sorry, Victoria. I know that doesn't change anything, but I need you to know how sorry I am. I was scared and desperate, and I thought I was protecting you. But I know what I did was wrong. I had imagined this moment for months, had rehearsed what I would say when my mother finally apologized. I had planned to tell her that sorry wasn't enough, that some betrayals couldn't be forgiven, that she had destroyed something precious that could never be rebuilt. But sitting in her living room, looking at the woman who had shaped me into who I was, I found that my carefully prepared words had deserted me. I know you were scared, I said instead. And I know you thought you were doing the right thing. But you weren't just protecting me, Mom. You were protecting yourself, and you used my career and my client as collateral damage for your own survival. She flinched as if I had struck her, but she didn't deny it. You're right, I was selfish. I was dying and I was terrified, and I made a choice that hurt people I should have protected. I don't know how to make that right. You can start by testifying against Rodriguez. Help us make sure he never has the power to hurt anyone else the way he hurt Marcus, the way he hurt me. I leaned forward, studying her face. And then you can live with what you did, the same way I've been living with the consequences of your choices. The trial of Detective Carlos Rodriguez became a media sensation, a symbol of police corruption, and the failure of the justice system to protect the innocent. I testified about how he had used my mother's desperation to manipulate privileged information, how he had orchestrated my downfall as revenge for my previous victories against him in court. My mother testified about the pressure he had applied, the threats he had made, the way he had preyed on her fear and desperation. Rodriguez was convicted on 17 counts of civil rights violations, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. Marcus Rivera was released after serving 11 months for a crime he didn't commit, and 3 other innocent men were freed as well. The city paid out millions in settlements to Rodriguez's victims, and the police department implemented new oversight procedures to prevent similar corruption in the future. But for me, the victory felt hollow. My reputation had been partially restored. The media coverage of the trial painted me as a whistleblower who had sacrificed her career to expose corruption. But my law practice was gone forever. The trust I had built with clients over years of dedicated service had been shattered by my mother's betrayal and my own temporary complicity in the system's failures. I kept my job as a public defender, finding a different kind of satisfaction in representing defendants who had no other options. The pay was still terrible and the caseload was overwhelming, but there was something pure about fighting for people who had been forgotten by everyone else. I was good at it, and my colleagues respected my experience and dedication. It wasn't the career I had planned, but it was meaningful work. My relationship with my mother proved harder to repair. She had survived her cancer treatment and returned to work at the hospital, but the trust between us had been fundamentally damaged. We spoke occasionally, stiff conversations about work, and weather that carefully avoided the deeper issues that had driven us apart. She invited me to family gatherings, and I sometimes attended, but we both knew that something essential had been broken that might never heal completely. The hardest part was reconciling the woman I had known my entire life with the person who had betrayed me so completely. I understood her desperation, her fear, her desire to protect both of us from destruction. But I couldn't forget that when faced with an impossible choice, she had chosen to sacrifice my integrity rather than find another way. She had taught me to fight for what was right, then abandon those principles when it became inconvenient. One evening in March, almost a year after Rodriguez's conviction, I found myself back in the parking garage where my mother had first handed me the evidence of my destruction. I was leaving the courthouse after a particularly difficult day. 3 clients sentenced to prison, 2 cases dismissed on technicalities, 1 young man who had reminded me too much of Marcus Rivera to represent effectively. I thought about the woman I had been before my mother's betrayal. Confident, idealistic, certain that justice and family loyalty were compatible values. That woman had been naive, perhaps, but she had also been hopeful in a way that I envied. The woman I had become was harder, more cynical, better equipped to navigate the moral complexities of a broken system, but less trusting of the people who claimed to love her. My phone buzzed with a text message from my mother. "Thinking of you today. Hope you're well." I stared at the message for a long time, remembering the woman who had sent me inspirational texts before every important court appearance, who had believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. That woman was still there, somewhere beneath the fear and desperation that had driven her to betray me. But she coexisted with the person who had traded my client's freedom for her own survival, and I wasn't sure I would ever be able to separate those two versions of my mother. I typed back, "I'm okay. Hope your treatment follow-up went well." It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was something. A recognition that families are complicated, that love and betrayal can coexist in the same heart, that justice isn't always as clear-cut as the law pretends it to be. My mother had taught me to fight for what I believed in, and I had used those lessons to destroy the man who had destroyed us both. In the end, maybe that was its own form of justice. Messy, imperfect, but real. Standing in that parking garage, I realized that I had spent the past year waiting for some kind of resolution, some moment of clarity that would make sense of everything that had happened. But life rarely provides such neat conclusions. Instead, we're left to carry our contradictions, our complicated relationships with the people who shape us, our understanding that even the people we love most are capable of betraying us in ways we never imagined. I got in my car and drove home to my studio apartment, to the simple life I had built from the ashes of my former ambitions. It wasn't the life I had planned, but it was mine. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between cases, I found a kind of peace in that. My mother had taught me that blood was thicker than water, but she had also taught me that sometimes the price of survival is too high to pay. In the end, perhaps the most important lesson was learning to live with both truths at the same time. The next morning brought a new case, a teenage girl accused of assault, her court-appointed attorney overwhelmed and inexperienced. I read through her file, recognizing the signs of a rushed investigation, planted evidence, witness intimidation. Another Rodriguez in the making, another innocent person being fed into the machine of corrupted justice. I picked up my phone and called the girl's mother, introducing myself and offering my services. There was hope in her voice when I explained my experience with police corruption cases, gratitude that someone with my background was willing to help her daughter. It reminded me why I had become a lawyer in the first place, before ambition and family loyalty had complicated everything. As I prepared for another fight against another corrupt system, I thought about the lessons my mother had taught me, both the ones she intended and the ones she probably wished she could take back. Trust carefully, but don't let cynicism paralyze you. Fight for justice, but understand that it comes in many forms. Love your family, but don't let that love blind you to their capacity for betrayal. And perhaps most importantly, sometimes the people who hurt you the most are the same ones who give you the tools to heal. My mother's betrayal had destroyed the life I had built, but it had also shown me who I really was when everything else was stripped away. I was someone who would sacrifice her own career to expose corruption, someone who would choose justice over family loyalty when the two came into conflict, someone who could rebuild from nothing and find meaning in the wreckage. That knowledge was worth something, even if it had come at a price I never wanted to pay. As I drove toward the courthouse to meet my new client, I carried that understanding with me like armor, hard-won wisdom that would protect me in the battles. Ahead and remind me that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that teach us how much we're willing to sacrifice for what we believe in. The cycle continues, as it always does in the law. New cases, new clients, new opportunities to fight for justice in an imperfect system. But now I approach each battle with the knowledge that even the people who love us most are capable of betrayal, and that sometimes the price of loyalty is too high to pay. It's a harder wisdom than the one I possessed before my mother's betrayal, but it's also truer, and truth, however painful, is always better than naive faith in the end.